Let's now have a look at our passage for today, which is from the book of Ruth. So if you grab a Bible that's in front of you, we're going to look at Ruth chapter 1. And we've been doing this series over the last few weeks on the purposes of God. God has a purpose for each one of us. And it's been a bit of a royal theme over the last week. So last Sunday, Tara spoke on Queen Esther, and today I'm speaking on the great-grandmother of King David, who is Ruth. So Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Kilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Kilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons that they could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. God has a purpose for your life, but your purpose often emerges not from ease and comfort and from things going well, but very often from times of difficulty. The book of Ruth starts with these words, "In the time of the judges." Now, the time of the judges was a time of real difficulty for the people of Israel. It was a time of chaos. It was a time of division. It was a time of these cycles of the people of God believing in God, then rejecting him, believing in God, rejecting him, being invaded by the other nations. There was no cohesion. It was chaotic, and it was uncertain, and it was difficult. In the time of the judges. This is their context. And then, more than that, they've suffered economic hardship. There's been a famine, which has affected them personally. On top of the economic hardship, there is also personal tragedy. Naomi has lost her husband and both her sons. Ruth has lost her husband. And so life has not turned out as they thought it would, or imagined it would. It's a time of heartbreak, disappointment, tragedy. But there's also perhaps a hint of regret, because God had promised to be with his people, and there's just a hint that when Naomi left Israel to go to Moab, that it wasn't quite the right decision. That under pressure, she and her husband had made the wrong decision. They had compromised in a crisis. And so there is regret. And so you have this context of uncertainty and chaos, difficulty, pain, disappointment, heartbreak, regret. And in the middle of all these things, the purpose for Ruth's life emerges. And as with Esther that we looked at last week, it doesn't come from the voice of an angel. It doesn't come from an audible voice from God. It doesn't come from anything very clear and obvious. But what emerges is a clear conviction of what Ruth has to do, which is to love the person in front of her. When things fall apart, when resources have dried up, when life is tough and confusing and painful, focus on loving the ones in front of you. This is what Ruth does. She sees this woman in front of her, Naomi, who has lost her husband and her sons. And she says, I don't know about everything else, but I can love this person. And so she loves this person who is right in front of her. When we were back in Brighton, before we came to Rio, we had 13 years in Brighton. And while we were there, in one of our first few years, there was a guy who came and joined the church. And he started helping with the band, with the music. He was a very talented musician. But we also knew that he was in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. And he'd been stable for a little while, and we were trying to look after him. And there came one Thursday evening for band practice where he just didn't turn up. And then on the Sunday, he was supposed to be playing, but he wasn't there. And so Paul, the worship pastor, and I started looking for him. So we went round to his home, but there was no sign of him. But we could see through the window, we could see bottles of alcohol around the room. So then we kept on looking, and we eventually found him in hospital. And he had had a major relapse. He was in a really bad way. He'd been in hospital for a few days. And so we took him from hospital, and we took him to Paul's home. And so Paul's wife, Sarah, she moved in with Tara in our home. Then I moved in with Paul. And we made a few phone calls. We gathered a few people round. And essentially, we created a rota. So what we did, we started sitting with our friend Tom through the night. And we'd taken turns to sit with him and pray with him and just be with him. We rang a doctor to ask what to do, because we'd emptied Paul's house of any alcohol. And the doctor said, how much have you been drinking? Okay, go to the off license now and buy him some alcohol. Otherwise, it's very, very dangerous for him medically. So Paul, the worship pastor, went off to the off license to buy a large bottle of vodka and took it back to the house. And so anyway, we were looking after this guy. And so for the next few days, that's what the people in the church did. We sat with him through the night, people giving up sleep, sitting with him, praying for him, looking after him, until eventually he could go into rehab. And one of the people who was looking after him had experience with quite a lot of people who were in recovery from drugs and alcohol. And she said to us, look, this is amazing. And it had a profound impact on this guy's life. But I know so many people in his position. And we can't do this for everyone. But Archie Coates, who was my boss, the senior pastor of the church, he used to say, do for the one what you wish you could do for everyone. And do for the one what you wish you could do for everyone. And we thought, well, we might not be able to do this for everyone in Brighton, but we can do it for this one. And actually, that's how we live the Christian life. God is infinite, and so his capacity to love everyone is infinite. But we are finite, we are limited. We have limited time, limited energy, limited resources. And so our job is just to love the person in front of us, to do for the one what we wish we could do for everyone. And so as you're walking the street to Rio, you might come across someone who is without a home and is hungry. And you might think, I can't feed everyone who is without a home in Rio, but maybe I could buy this person something to eat. You might think, I can't pray for everyone in Rio by name, but maybe there's one person or two people that I can pray for regularly. Maybe I can't invite everyone on Alpha, but maybe I'll invite this one person. And then just to do for the one what we wished we could do for everyone. And because that is how we love. When Jesus was asked what the most important commandments were, he said, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he was asked to explain, what does it mean to love your neighbor? And he said, it means, he told the story of the Good Samaritan. It means loving the person you come across who is in need. And this is really the logic behind marriage. A marriage is where we can't love everyone completely and with total commitment and forever and totally self-sacrificially. But for those who are called to get married, you can love one person. Okay, this is the person that God's asked me to marry, and so I will love them and be devoted to them and look after them. To love the one. That is the calling for you and for me, is to love the person in front of us. But how do we love the person in front of us? What does it mean to love? Well, there are a few things in this story about how to actually love people. And the first thing is to enter into their world. So Ruth says to Naomi, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So if you imagine two people, so this is me, and this is you. Or just so yourself and then the other person. And everyone within themselves has various interests, and you have your own story, and you have your own needs. Oh, this is a long word. And then the same for the other person. The other person has their interests and story, their story, and they have their needs. And so when we love one another, there are two ways to love one another. One is where what you do is you invite that person into your world. So you say, and this is what you might call hospitality. Oh dear. My spelling, even in English, is terrible. So this is hospitality, where you say, this is my house, welcome in. This is my world, come on in. These are my interests, come and share in them. But what Ruth does with Naomi is she enters into the other person's world. She says, actually, your story is going to become my story. Your country is going to be my country. Your culture will become my culture. What's important to you is going to be important to me. Your needs are going to become the things that I attend to. And this is the essential first step of love, is by going to where the other person is. It's you before me. And so the most essential skills of loving people is listening. A Lutheran theologian, Paul Tillich, used to say the first duty of love is to listen. It means asking questions more than expressing our own opinion. It means being willing to enter into what's going on in their world before drawing people into your own world. Because this is what, of course, Jesus did. He came to us before he brought us into his world. It means going to where the other person is and entering into their world. So it means entering their world. The second thing it means is committing to the other person. It says that Ruth clung to her. She committed to her. She wouldn't let go of her. And this is particularly important when you felt rejected. I mean, Ruth had suffered so much. Her husband had died. She'd been let down. And then Naomi says, you stay here, I'll go off by myself. No, don't stay with me, I'm going by myself. And Ruth could so easily have felt, okay, if you don't want me, forget it, I'm going back to my own family. But despite the feeling of being pushed away, Ruth clings to Naomi. She says, I'm going to stick with you no matter what. When we went to St. Peter's, Brighton, when we felt called to go there, part of that calling was around the leaders of that church, Archie and his wife, Sam. And we felt we wanted to support them. They were going to pastor this church, and we wanted to help them and support them. And we just said, look, whatever happens, we're with you. But there came a moment where Tara said to me, look, we've come here to support Archie and Sam and to help them, whatever happens. But I know that one day, Jonny, you might get a vision for a church in a new place and feel like it's right for our family to move from Brighton and go somewhere else. And I want you to know, if that ever happens, I'm staying here with Archie and Sam in Brighton. So that wasn't very encouraging. And thankfully, we've come here, just so you know, it's the whole family. But it's that thing of commitment, of saying, actually, I'm not going to leave you. No matter what, I'm sticking with you. And you see this as some beautiful examples in the Bible. There's a moment towards the end of Elijah's life where his young assistant, Elisha, is with him. And Elijah keeps on saying to Elisha, you stay here, I'm going on my own. But Elisha says, no, I'm not leaving you. Wherever you go, I'm not leaving you. I'm going to cling on to you. Or you think of the example of Mary and Joseph in the New Testament, where Joseph has committed himself to Mary, but then finds out she's pregnant. And so that's pushing him away. But he thinks, no, even though you're pregnant, I'm not the father. I'm committing to you. I'm not letting go of you. And often the commitment, you can understand the commitment when it's romantic, because romance creates this energy that wants you to commit to the other person. Or where there's blood ties, where it's your children or your parents or your siblings. But here, Naomi is her mother-in-law. There's no blood connection. It's not romantic. It's not a blood connection. And yet she wants to commit to her no matter what. It reminds me very much of the Lord of the Rings, of Frodo and Sam in the Lord of the Rings. There's that beautiful scene in Lord of the Rings where Frodo realizes that he needs to go to Mordor by himself. And so he gets into the boat and he starts paddling away. But Sam, his closest friend, runs after him. And you have this beautiful moment where Frodo shouts to Sam, "Go back, Sam. I'm going to Mordor alone." And Sam replies, "Of course you are, and I'm coming with you." And so Sam wades into the water. He almost drowns. Frodo shouts to him, "You can't swim, Sam." And so Sam goes under the water. Frodo has to rescue him. And then Sam gets into the boat and he says, I made a promise, Mr. Frodo, a promise. Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee. And I don't mean to. I don't mean to. It's commitment. So we enter into the other person's world. We commit to them. And then the next dimension of this love is that it is selfless and sacrificial. Because for Ruth to say to Naomi, okay, I'm going with you, she was giving up so much. To say, okay, I'll go to your country, to your home. She'll say, okay, I'm giving up my home. I'm giving up my country. I'm giving up my family. I'm giving up the language that I'm familiar with. I'm giving up knowing how things work. And I'm going to go to a place where I have no idea how things are going to work. But because she loves her, she's willing to give up everything that's most precious to her, all that she needs for the sake of the one she loves. And this is an essential element of love. And actually, it always happens with love. Whenever there is love, there's always an exchange. So if your friend is having a tough time and you think, let's meet up for coffee, you have a cup of coffee together and your friend talks to you about what's going on in their life. And what tends to happen is your friend feels better, but you feel worse. Or if you have a young child who's struggling to sleep, what happens is you get up and give up your sleep so that you can help the other person to sleep. When I first met Tara, her life, and when we started dating, it became very obvious that her life was very ordered and worked very well, whereas my life was chaotic and didn't work very well. And so in order to get married, there was this exchange where Tara brought into her life more chaos than she thought was possible, and I brought into my life more order than I thought was necessary. So that was how that worked. But there is always this exchange when we love one another. But for Ruth, it meant giving up so much. It meant even giving up the prospect of getting married again, which of that culture was not only secured your identity, but was also all your protection, all your provision. And yet she gives it up. Actually, that was one of the things that I was most struck by when Tara and I started dating. I was kept on trying to persuade her to go on these dates with me and to spend time with me. But she couldn't. She wasn't available on Saturdays because she spent her time with two young girls whose mother had HIV and so couldn't look after her very well. And so that was how Tara spent her Saturdays and so couldn't spend time with me. Love is self-sacrificial, giving up what's most precious to us, what's known, what's familiar, what we need for the sake of the other. It's also practical. So when Ruth says she's going to go with Naomi, it's not just, oh, I love you so much, an expression of feelings. It's actually something very practical. It means that she's going to go with her to Bethlehem and work incredibly hard to provide for them both. And love is always practical. The psychiatrist and writer M. Scott Peck wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled. And in it, he has a chapter called Love is Not a Feeling. And he gives an example of two people who visited him to see him. And he said one of them was a mother who was struggling to connect with her child. And she said, I don't love my child. And she was really traumatized by this. And he asked her, are you feeding your child? Oh, yes, I feed my child. Have you provided shelter for your child? Oh, yes, I'm doing that. Are you clothing your child and changing your baby's nappy? Oh, yeah, I do all those things. Are you protecting it from harm? Oh, yeah, I'm protecting it from harm. He said, you love your child. You may be struggling with some of the emotion, but you love your child. And then he says, contrasted with another guy who came to see him, a father who just talked always about how much he loved his daughter. Just his heart ached and swelled whenever he thought about his daughter. And he said to him, "Oh, so when's her birthday?" "Oh, I can never remember that." How often do you see her?" I actually haven't seen her for years." "Do you provide for her?" "No, I can't actually provide, but my heart, I just love her so much." And he said to him, "You don't love your daughter." Because love is not a feeling. It's something very practical. And when we love one another, we love them practically. So love is this thing where we enter the other person's life. We commit to them. We love them selflessly and self-sacrificially. We love them practically. And love is always an adventure. For Ruth, when loving Naomi means going off to a foreign country. And actually, there's a sense in which when you love someone, you're always entering a foreign country. Because whenever you love someone, it's never a case, actually, of someone just being absorbed into your world or you being absorbed into their world. What actually happens is a new reality emerges of you and the other person together. The great writer Vincent Donovan said, actually, this is the essence of being a Christian, the Christian ministry, loving other people. It's not going to where other people are, no matter how beautiful a place that is, nor people coming to where you are, no matter how great that is. It's you and they going to a new place that neither of you have experienced or been in before. I mean, that's if you have children. You can't just absorb children into your life. You go to a new place. There's a new reality. If you get married, a new reality is created. And so love is always an adventure. Or when, for example, if you get a new pastor, say you've got a great church in Rio de Janeiro. You've got all these lovely people, lovely things going on. And then you've got a pastor who lives in Brighton. What happens is not just that the pastor is absorbed into the new church, nor that the new church is absorbed into the pastor, but in the pastor loving the church and the church loving the pastor, what happens is both of you are brought to a new place that neither of you have experienced before, a new reality. Because love is always an adventure. This love that we see with Ruth is totally extraordinary. And there's this interesting contrast with Orpah, who is married to Naomi's other son. Because Orpah is a great daughter-in-law. She's kind, she's devoted, she's committed. But her love just goes to a certain limit and not beyond. It's everything that you could expect, totally reasonable. But Ruth's love goes beyond. It's beyond anything you could expect, anything that anyone could say was reasonable. It's something totally extraordinary. And that love begins to have an impact. It's so powerful. It secures our identity. Notice at the end of this chapter, Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi. My name is Mara, bitter, because my life has been made bitter." But she never gets called Mara in this story. Because of the love that she's experienced, even the love that she's experienced is stronger even than her attempts to define herself by her misfortune and by her mistakes. At the end of this chapter, it says, the barley harvest was beginning. Because this kind of love gives us hope for the future. It's a hint that something's about to happen. After a long, barren, and difficult times, there's new hope. Something is about to emerge. And I wonder whether there are some people here today, and life has been really tough for maybe a long time, and you need to know that the barley harvest is beginning. Something new is about to emerge. And the impact of this love goes beyond anything we could ever imagine. Ruth is just this obscure foreigner living in an obscure part of Israel. And yet, through her action of loving one other person and everything that happens in the rest of the book of Ruth, she becomes the great-grandmother of King David, the greatest king that Israel will ever have. But that is beyond anything that she imagined. She couldn't see the impact. She was just loving the person in front of her. And we can never see that. When I was 18, I left school and I applied to Oxford University to study theology. And my grades hadn't been very good, and Oxford University is quite difficult to get into. It's quite academic and selective. But I thought I'd have a go anyway. So I applied for Oxford, and when you go to Oxford, in those days, you used to have interviews at different colleges. It's made up of these separate colleges within Oxford. And so I had interviews at 5 different colleges. And they were fine, some were easier than others. But then I went to this college, Oriel, where I had an interview with the professor there. And I turned up in the room, ready for my interview, and this young woman came forward and said, "Hi, I'm Sharon." And I thought, the professor is male, and I think around in his 50s, so this isn't the right person. And she said, "Oh, I'm doing the interview with you." So I thought, oh, great. She seemed about 23, 24. Anyway, we had a great conversation. I felt very relaxed. We discussed various different things. And then I left and thought nothing of it. And then later, I was offered a place at Oriel College, and I had a great time at Oxford University. And then I'd forgotten all about it. Around 10 years later, I was at a dinner for other people who'd been ordained. I'd got ordained by that stage. I was in Brighton. And at this dinner, I sat next to this woman, and she said, "Oh, hi, I'm Sharon." And then she looked at me and said, "Oh, do you remember me?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, you interviewed me. Thank you. That was great." And she said, "Do you know what had happened?" I said, "Oh, no." She said, "The reason I interviewed you was because there was something on your application form that meant the professor decided they definitely weren't going to take you. It wasn't even worth interviewing you. So he said to me, one of his students, 'Why didn't you talk to him?' And she said, but our conversation, she saw something in me during that conversation that meant she thought I should have a place. And so she went back to the professor and said, 'I think you should take Jonny.' And he said, 'Absolutely not, because of various things that weren't actually connected with me, but things associated with me.' And so he said, 'Absolutely not.' And she said, 'No, that's discrimination. You need to take him.' And she argued, and she would not let go until I'd been offered a place. And I was just so grateful. I was offered one of the 2 places there, and I was so grateful to her. But for Sharon, she didn't know actually the impact of that decision. She didn't know that we would then end up having, that while I was at university, I'd meet a guy called James, who would become one of my closest friends. We lived together in a shared house in my second year. When I graduated, I moved down to London, but he moved to Brighton. And when he heard about a new church in Brighton, he persuaded me to go down to Brighton and to join the team there. And so I joined this team in Brighton. We had many years that we absolutely loved there. And one Sunday, I'd given a talk, and there was a guy visiting St. Peter's Brighton who knew one of the other people on staff. And he was a pastor who'd been spending a few years in Rio de Janeiro at a church called Christ Church. And he just happened to visit this church in Brighton, to visit one of the other team. And so we met at the end of the service, and we had a brief little chat. And he then came back to Rio de Janeiro, and he was sitting in this church a few years after that, and that conversation with me just kept on coming to his mind. And so he thought, I just think I need to send an email to Jonny. And so he sent an email to me saying, I've been praying about the future of this church, and I just wonder whether it might be something for you. And I just can't get you out of my head, so I thought I'd send you an email. And that was all part of the story of getting us here to Rio de Janeiro. Now, Sharon didn't know any of that. She didn't know. She was just trying to love the person in front of her and do what was right for the person she saw. She had no idea that she was finding a new pastor for a church in Rio de Janeiro in 20 years hence. But it's the impact of loving the one in front of us. And yet this love often feels impossible. Because although we would love to love people in this way, we want to, the problem is that within us, there tends to be just quite a lot of chaos and pain and rejection and hurt and selfishness that makes it difficult to love one another in these extraordinary ways. But Ruth was always pointing ahead to someone more. Her great-grandson was David, but one of her later descendants, descended from David, would be Jesus. And Jesus would come into the world, and he would love people like no one had ever loved. He would love them with this extraordinary commitment, saying, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. He would love them practically, washing his disciples' feet, healing the sick, feeding those who are hungry, driving out demons. He was loved totally selflessly and self-sacrificially. And then he said to each one of us, your world will be my world. Your country will be my country. Your pain will be my pain. Your guilt will be my guilt. Your shame will be my shame. Your death will be my death. But not even death will be able to separate us. And this love, Paul says, has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. This total, extraordinary love has been given to each one of us. It's been poured into our hearts, not only so that we know that we are loved, but so that we can love one another with the purpose, and that is the purpose for which God has made each of us. Amen. Amen.